Okay, you're recording, go ahead. And there's an agenda in the chat that Marion put in for everybody's benefit.
Thanks, Jane, and hello, everyone. Just before we start, I just wanted to, there's the transportation conversation we're going to be having as the agenda notes, and I understand that A&R has done sort of a gap analysis, Colin and others, that may be a helpful place to start. They were going to provide a little presentation on that, and I wondered if we might flip a couple of the components of that agenda. Start with that gap analysis, talk about the rulemaking, because the advanced clean cars, advanced clean trucks are going to get us partway there, and then talk about the public engagement and the RFP. If folks don't mind that flow, it seems like the context would be helpful to understand before we get into the what we're going to do about it conversation.
Thanks, Joey. Any comments on that? Sounds fine to me. So, Jane, just confirming we have a quorum. All right, we're underway. Thank you. And hello, everybody. We're settling into the phase of work for the committee that lies between adoption of the CAP and the work that we need to do to, pursue next steps across all of our major issue areas. So I think we're into a phase of work that is largely driven by the work groups and open to any member of the committee putting on the overall agenda topics that you think we should be addressing, taking up, in an organized way over the next few months. But today's agenda really follows the path of pursuing the work of the task groups that came out of the Climate Action Plan, and as well as discussing, where we think we might be with respect to either implementation of legislation or additional legislation that we would like to have in mind for next year. Any general comments from folks about that? Before we should just dive into it. Okay, the agenda for today, again, that we've had that one comment from Joey. Other than that, that's all right. Are people ready to approve the minutes of the last meeting? Any comments other than yes, approve the minutes? Okay. Thanks, Bram. Okay, we consider them approved. Jane, I think you're up for discussion of subcommittee composition, et cetera, report from the steering committee.
Sure, I didn't put that on, but happy to do that too. And I realized when I just clicked on the agenda that I didn't really put who's on first for which agenda item, but I think everybody knows who they are, and we'll do that better next time. So subcommittee changes. Obviously, this is the first committee meeting without Commissioner Walk joining anymore. He's still in his in-between work phase of starting a new job and time off. So want to talk through what that means for the subcommittee and propose a few changes as we've been discussing it to prep for today. So you'll recall that the process roadmap lays out a clear path for co-chairs, that we'll have one legislatively appointed co-chair, council member, and then one administrative council member appointee. And so that left a handful of folks to consider when thinking about promoting someone to co-chair. And luckily, TJ has graciously agreed, although he went off camera. It was like he knew I was going to say his name and he decided to run. He's having second thoughts. But TJ, on behalf of the PSD and on behalf of Commissioner Tierney, is willing to step in as co-chair. So why don't I pause there, and then we'll talk about that composition first, and then there's a few other changes based on shifting dynamics and nominations from other subcommittees that I'd like to bring up also. So really excited that TJ is willing to step up into this position. So excited that he's willing to do it. And I think Rich is excited too. So I'll let Rich say something.
I'm very happy. TJ and I have spoken, and I look forward to partnering with TJ as I was able to partner also with Peter Walker in a very productive way. And I just would say, welcome aboard, TJ. It's great that you're willing to serve, and I personally look forward to it.
Yeah, thank you. I look forward to working with you all too, and hopefully my connection will remain stable here throughout. And I just to also point out, I think it is a good nexus here with the department having responsibility of the comprehensive energy plan, which is consistent with the climate action plan as it was required to be. Just look forward to working with you all to kind of move all those policies forward in the near future.
All right, thanks, TJ. Back to you,
So so the formal process, although it feels formal, and the steering committee always acts in accordance, has always acted in accordance with subcommittees, is for you all to, recommend that TJ will assume the co-chairship, and then along with some of these other changes for subcommittee composition that we're about to discuss, the next time the steering committee meets, I should say, the first week of June, they'll officially sign off on the changes for the composition of cross-sector. But for today, we'll have TJ stepping in as co-chair, and then from there on out, the other thing that, as we were discussing with TJ, his role as co-chair, it became clear that with Peter's departure, there was no representation for the Agency of Natural Resources on this subcommittee. And because ANR is ultimately responsible for the emissions reductions as per the GWSA, it made sense to have someone from ANR not merely staffing this subcommittee, I think for some of us as we discussed it, but to have somebody as an actual voting member on this subcommittee as we consider policy recommendations in this space. So we'd like to recommend that Megan O'Toole actually sit as a subcommittee member representing the Agency of Natural Resources. And I know you all know Megan, but Megan has, in the past 6 months or so now, I think it's just over 6 months, transitioned from being the air quality attorney who knows all these policies and regulations better than anybody, also into being the mitigation strategist for DEC Air Quality and Climate Division. I think as we get closer and closer to the budget being finalized, it's safe to say and start to speak about the Climate Action Office that we're assembling within the Agency of Natural Resources. Megan will be the Mitigation Strategy Program Manager in the Climate Office, and we'll be transitioning into the Climate Office from the Air Quality and Climate Division. So Megan is poised to lead on mitigation strategy for our agency, and makes a lot of sense for her to be here as a full subcommittee member with cross-sector. So that's one, and maybe I'll pause there, and then we have one more subcommittee member to recommend forward for you all to consider. Okay, thumbs
okay.
up.
Yeah. Megan,
then,
your background is terrific for this, and I look forward to working with you.
Thanks, Rich. Likewise.
I mean, we're going to miss Peter. Peter covered a lot of bases. That's so in that sense, substantively losing him means we're losing coverage on a bunch of things, and you're going to help fill that.
She'll do a great job filling it. And then finally, Adam Sherman's on the call today. Adam, thanks for turning your camera on. Adam works at VEIC. And Adam, cross-sector, a number of subcommittees had open spaces due to people moving on from the subcommittee due to new workloads and needing to diversify the subcommittee composition. And Science and Data was one of those subcommittees that put out an open nomination process to consider additional expertise for that subcommittee. Adam was nominated, both self-nominated and then nominated by 2 other people to serve on Science and Data for the expertise that he would bring for biomass, as well as in the life cycle analysis space. Science and Data had a tremendous nomination slate of people and has plenty of people to fill the different gaps on that subcommittee. And in conversations with Megan and Jared around subcommittee nominations, and because of the changing space and sphere on cross-sector, we made the suggestion that Adam would be better served to sit on this subcommittee because of the substantive work being carried forward in this space around biomass and transportation. And with Peter leaving, he was serving on the biomass task group. And then also as part of the brokering behind the scenes to get TJ to be co-chair, we also said that if TJ assumed and took on the additional work responsibilities of serving on the biomass task group, as co-chair, that he will likely want to step down from the biomass task group. And so we've been trying to have that task group staffed by 3 subcommittee members from cross-sector, 3 from Ag and Eco, and then Science and Data has 2 people there, could have 3 if they wanted, but for now it's 2. And so it just felt like Adam could be with Liz, at least having 2 clear and consistent touch points from cross-sector on the biomass task group to really be thinking about cross-sector's interests in that task group, and then bringing back that information to you all. So while you did not have a nomination process that was as transparent and clear for new nominations, Adam went through a very transparent and clear nomination process and could be serving on Science and Data, and we're choosing to recommend his expertise on this subcommittee instead, which feels good to me. And so want to recommend that in addition to Megan, Adam also step in on this subcommittee as a full member. And then we appoint him to the biomass task group, which he already was gracious enough to sit in on Wednesday.
So Jane, thanks for the explanation. Comments, I'd like to hear from our steering committee members, but Christine, you've got your hand up.
Well, I can wait if you want to hear from them. Well, I'm delighted by this. I'm very, very pleased that this is under consideration, and I would encourage us to move forward. I've known Adam, I think, since he started at Burke, however many long years ago that was, and I've known his work in biomass from day one there. And then when VEIC acquired Burke back not quite 10 years ago, I was led the due diligence for that with Dave Barish at that time at VEIC, and worked very closely with Adam and a couple of other former Burkers for quite a good long time. So I'm delighted that Adam now knows far more about biomass than I do, and he'll bring a lot of good expertise and knowledge and political savvy to this group, in my humble opinion.
Okay, thanks, Christine. Jared, steering committee recommendations and whatever else you have to say.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think all of those recommendations are wonderful and fully support them, including TJ as co-chair and adding Megan and Adam as full subcommittee members. I'll say Rich, I can attest to the fact that TJ is a great co-chair. Diligent, great on work planning and time. We miss him on Science and Data, but Megan has been awesome as the co-chair over there, and it's really great to have the connections between those 2 subcommittees, given how related the work is. So that's great. And I would just say, Adam comes so highly recommended from so many folks. He's not just a Vermont expert on this stuff, but really a global expert when it comes to understanding wood and wood heating and biomass and kind of emissions, and have just admired his work for such a long time, reports that he's done for the Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Forest and Parks, Public Service Department, Clean Energy Development Fund. I feel like we're really lucky to get his experience and expertise on a volunteer basis for this subcommittee. So thank you all for being willing to serve and stepping forward, and full support for all 3 of those nominations.
Thanks, Jared. Liz?
Yeah, I can just say agree. And, you know, as someone who sat on the Biomass Subcommittee as it's gotten its work going, yesterday was the first, I would say technically substantive meeting of the subgroup, which was great. We could use Adam's expertise. I think it makes a lot of sense given the connections to our areas of work. So I think it's really appropriate all the way around. And of course, TJ and Megan as well. So, and I am a member of the steering committee as well. And yeah, I hate to say on behalf of the steering committee, but I do think that it's widely supported. And so, yes, I would appreciate it if we move forward that way.
All right, thanks. Anybody else? What I'm hearing, I can take as consensus of the committee and report that back to the steering committee, that we approve all 3 of these nominations. Okay, Jane, thanks for leading us through that. And thanks for comments, everybody.
I wanted to, Rich, one final point on that is that at the council meeting on May 16th, we'll start that day with a presentation from Iris, Councilmember Iris, and she will speak to a proposal that she's put forward around youth membership on subcommittees. And so I just want to highlight that the proposal as agreed to by the steering committee, but recommended to go to the full council for discussion, is that Iris's last meeting will be the May meeting of the council. She will step down. Obviously, there'll be a new youth member represented in her seat on the council. But in addition to having one youth voice on the council, Iris has put forward a framework working closely with VEEP that actually proposes to have a youth rep voice on all subcommittees, 5 different members. The counselor would sit on one, and then 4 other subcommittee members who would be different youth voices. And then I'll let her speak to this on the council at the council meeting, but with VEEP support has put together an amazing sort of background support system for those voices, including even college credits for them to be serving on these subcommittees, which is really exciting. And so the subcommittee, while sort of staffed and set up now with all of you, will also be hopefully looking to take a new member who represents the youth voice on the subcommittee going forward too. But we'll pause on that until after the council meeting on the 16th.
Thanks, Jane. That's actually exciting news. That's great to hear. All right, our next topic is legislative update. Somebody want to give us the state of the clean heat standard? Jared, do you want to speak to that?
Actually, I was wondering if Joey might be able to. I'm not as familiar with the latest details as she or others may be.
Okay.
I mean, I can take a stab and then others round it out, but people may know that the clean heat standard has passed both bodies. In the Senate about a week ago, there was an amendment attached to it that was put forward by Senator Kitchell and approved through the Senate Appropriations Committee, I believe on a unanimous vote, essentially, which would require a check back on the program, so that making it incumbent upon the Public Utility Commission to craft a rule and send that rule back to the legislature for their review, potential changes to, and then approval of another affirmative vote of actually implementing the program. So that amendment was supported by the full Senate and then sent over to the House, where the House essentially concurred with the Senate's amendment. And so now the clean heat standard has passed both bodies on pretty strong votes in both chambers. It does sound like that the governor, the sort of check back amendment was one provision that he was very interested in, is my understanding, but it doesn't sound like this amendment, which goes further than what I thought he had originally asked for, is going to scratch the itch. So it the legislature did deliver the bill and sent it to the governor's desk. He has 5 days to either sign, veto, or let the bill move into law without his signature. So it's on the governor's desk, and now it's sort of a waiting game about whether or not he will decide to sign or veto or let the bill become law without signature. So I don't know if people want to say more about where they understand the governor to be, or anything more in more detail about the amendment and what, the bill itself, but it did, get some improvements in the House, or changes in the House and in the Senate. And now here we have a bill on the governor's desk.
Okay.
What else would you like to say?
All right. Thanks, Joey. I guess we await future developments.
And I don't know if people know, if they have a better sense of, again, where the governor will come down on this, but what I have heard is it's a likely veto.
Jared, your hand is up.
Thanks, Rich. And I just want to kind of leave the politics aside and put this in context in terms of what it means for the Global Warming Solutions Act and our ability to meet our legal requirements. And just note, as I think we all know, but I think it's important to reiterate, that this was by far the single largest emissions reduction policy recommendation in the Climate Action Plan, designed to deliver a full third of the emissions reductions required by 2030. And if it does not go into law, especially on the heels of TCIP not going forward, then the single largest emissions reduction strategy we would have moving forward would simply be Advanced Clean Cars 2, which may get us 10%. Those numbers may change depending on the final California rule. So we were already dealing with a significant gap, a plan that did not add up post what happened with TCI. If this bill does not go forward, we are going to need to very rapidly reconvene as a subcommittee and as a council to figure out how we can make recommendations that can meet our legal responsibility to have a plan that adds up. So we will wait and see. We will see what happens. But if it does not pass into law, that puts the entire climate action plan and our plans to meet these legal, and I would argue moral responsibilities on really, really uncertain ground.
Any other comments, or should we just run through the rest of the legislative list? I mean, I'm happy to have a discussion, but frankly, we don't know yet. And as Jared says, we might need to reconvene and figure out what steps the committee wants to take to recommend to the council, depending on what happens with the legislation. Christine?
I have a follow-up question for Jared. I'm wondering, Jared, or others, just how broadly understood or how well socialized is what you just stated within the legislature?
I mean, I hesitate to speak to it definitively. I think it's certainly well known by the committees of jurisdiction that focus on the Clean Heat Standard, certainly in the House Energy and Technology Committee and in the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. And you know, I believe that that's clearly understood by leadership in both chambers. You know, and I think it's more broadly understood by, you know, folks who've been following the news and the commentaries that have been put out, where that information has been clearly repeated by a number of authors, including many counselors. You know, so yeah.
Thank you.
I guess I would amend Jared's, or whatever the right word is here, add to Jared's statement a little bit. It's clearly understood in the committees of jurisdiction. It's a little less clear how well understood the lack of progress would be in folks on other committees.
And I think, given that we do not have other, you know, that we've passed a climate action plan that had a number of recommendations for legislation, and this may be getting ahead of ourselves, but if some of those legislative recommendations don't pass, the recourse that is identified in the Global Warming Solutions Act when things don't add up is A&R rulemaking and regulation. And so I think that is what we will have to turn our attention to very quickly if we're going to meet our requirements and responsibility, because there's just no way that I can see, speaking as a person who is appointed to provide energy and data analysis and who's modeled all the pathways, you know, with EAN, looked at all of the work that's been done by Cadmus and EFG in the pathways report for the CAP. There's just no way that we can have confidence in this plan adding up with a straight face by 2030 if the two largest recommendations for emissions reduction do not go forward.
Thanks, Jared. I think we should just move on to the other bills that are pending in the legislature. TJ, can you give us an update on the weatherization bill?
Yeah, this is still pending, but in the budget bill, we have $80 million, maybe on a more positive note, $80 million dedicated to weatherization. That's $45 million for Office of Economic Opportunity and $35 million via the Department of Public Service to Efficiency Vermont for low, moderate income efficiency through ARPA dollars. That's on, you know, on top of, you know, the small amounts that were allocated last year of $4 million to OEO and $5 million to Efficiency Vermont, with another $9 going to VHFA, Housing Finance Administration, for weatherization. Side note is that I think VHFA and utilities are just about ready to submit tariffs to the Public Utility Commission to implement the to-the-meter financing for weatherization for low to moderate income households. Actually, I guess that financing would be available to higher income also, but with a little different incentives. So that's in the budget bill, so it is still pending, but that kind of flew through with, you know, compared to some of the other issues we talked about, relatively little discussion. I think everybody was really on board with those investments, and I would see those staying, the budget bill.
Thanks, TJ. The environmental justice bill. Someone report on that?
I can do it too, Joe, just as it relates to our agency. Obviously, it cleared the House yesterday, and it goes back to the Senate now to concur. And I do think that this one's in a really good place. It's been scaled down from the original bill, but it's really focused now on a couple things. One, on a mapping tool that would help direct resources to align to frontline and impacted communities. We would have a number of years, the Agency of Natural Resources, to stand up that tool and 2 positions to do that. In addition, it would fully fund our diversity, equity, inclusion coordinator that we have currently within the Agency of Natural Resources. That's only half-time. She would become a full-time position. Yeah, so I think the challenge hasn't ever been about what's in it, but about scaling the size of the bill to the amount of resources they had to put towards it. And for now, it has felt like it's in a place where the ask and the resources together match, and it looks likely. So sounds positive, but it looks likely. We'll see.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that, Jean, is that it extended some of the timelines too, which is a favorable thing for the agencies on reporting and baseline setting. So that's good too.
Thanks, Jane. And other legislative actions to report on, things in the budget?
Go ahead, Joy. I was going to jump in, but go ahead.
I mean, please round it out, but two things I would report on. Well, starting first with the municipal energy resilience bill. As people know, it was a $48.4 million investment in helping municipalities weatherize and improve the energy efficiency of municipal buildings, potentially, access more clean heating equipment. It is now that bill is under consideration in, well, it got passed both House and Senate, and now there's an amendment to it being considered in Senate Natural. They've dropped the dollar amount down to about 35 million. It's still a very significant commitment to helping municipalities invest in weatherization and thermal improvements and fuel switching. So that's great. And there is a potential amendment being considered right now in Senate Natural that would clarify or potentially constrain the ability of those grant dollars, which would be something in the order of 26 million to go towards fossil fuel heating systems, new fossil fuel heating systems. So I anticipate the bill moving forward in one way or another. What happens with that amendment is to be determined, but that's great. And then I just was going to say, or have ideally, maybe this is what you're going to talk about, TJ, in the budget, pretty significant commitment to transportation, something on the order of 40 million, about $20 million each to of electric vehicle supply equipment, with about 30% of those dollars going to multi-unit dwellings. And then I'll let the AOT team get into more detail, but $40 million commitment, about another 20 million going into incentives. So I just want to make sure that we're flagging both of those things as pretty significant commitments and investments, which are also something to celebrate.
Questions or comments for Joey? I do have a question or clarification. When you referred to the amendment that's being considered on the municipal resilience bill, was this an amendment to restrict the amount of funding that might end up supporting new fossil investments, or to permit it?
Well, I mean, municipalities will be able to avail themselves of up to $500,000, $500,000 for municipal energy resilience and efficiency improvements, et cetera. This amendment, I understand, being offered by some members of Senate Natural, and will be an amendment on the floor, would clarify that grant dollars could not necessarily, or constrain grant dollars from being used to help municipalities invest in new fossil fuel heating equipment for the grants only.
For the grant portion.
So if a municipality does, so $5 million of this program would go to help municipalities do a full assessment of their municipal energy portfolio and needs. So municipalities would be able to do a full assessment if fossil fuel heating equipment would be required as a backup, or for some other reason. Municipalities can certainly do that. I believe the amendment is intended to sort of constrain grant dollars from going to helping communities invest in new fossil fuel heating equipment.
Okay, thank you. I see Liz and then TJ.
I can defer to TJ. I was just going to point out there is some other funding in the budget that hits some of the priorities and recommendations we made, including, I believe there's still funding in for direct consumer electrical upgrade running through the department, but TJ is the right person to ask, so I'll stop.
Yeah, I was going to comment on that. So thanks, Liz. There is $20 million in electric service upgrades in direct furtherance of the climate action plan recommendation there. That should come through our office. In addition to that, there's another $5 million for what is termed a switch and save program. That's for domestic hot water, heat pump hot water heaters. And largely, it's also another $2 million for load management or storage to help with resilience, and again managing all these loads that we're going to put on the electric grid. Related to that, and this isn't necessarily a direct recommendation of the Climate Council, but I also wanted to mention there's $8 million from general funds to support advanced metering infrastructure for municipal and cooperative utilities, which again will help maintain the headroom and reduce costs of all the electrification here, and really allow for a lot of services that are available in some areas of the state to be available across the statewide, and help all those customers save money and participate in the energy transition. The last thing I wanted to mention, it's not, I guess it's kind of in that same community resilience bill, but as part of the infrastructure bill, there's some monies, about $3 million allocated to the Public Service Department. Our plan was to do this, and they popped it in legislation anyway, which is fine, but we was to allocate some of that money to the State Energy Management Program expansion, which will allow Buildings and General Services to expand its program and help municipalities over the long term, even beyond ARPA monies, make energy improvements to their buildings. Part of that is direct grants. Part of it is funding to establish a revolving loan fund so that those can be sustainable and money can come back and we can do it in perpetuity. I think that's all of them that I had to
all right,
report.
thanks, TJ. Well, we'll have to see how the budget, what's in the budget when it emerges. Sounds like most of what you've described is accepted broadly. Joey, we need to move on to the next topic.
I just wanted to flag that it's probably no surprise this is cross sector, so we highlighted a lot of the mitigation stuff, but there's going to be a lot of good, significant budgetary commitments to and good bills moving in the resilience space as well. So I don't want to give that short shrift at all because it's incredibly important. And I was going to ask the same question that Gina asked in the chat. Will someone be sort of potentially writing up a summary of this? It feels like maybe collectively we can all do it, but it seems like important to sort of step back and reflect on what the legislature and the governor ideally supports and commits to regarding to climate adaptation, mitigation, resilience investments.
Joey, thank you. And Jane, I think, this is perhaps a request to put on your list or the list of agencies, staff supports for the council generally, a summary of what's happened in the legislature this year that could be shared across the whole council. Sounds like a really useful thing for.
Yeah, we did talk about that at the steering committee meeting on Monday and talked about it related to legislation, but I imagine respective agencies could do program summaries and put it all together.
Yeah, thank you. We're behind schedule a bit here, so I'd like to move on to the next topic, which is a report from the Transportation Work Group. I see Gina has arrived, and Joey, it's over to you.
Thanks, Rich. And per the earlier request, just to sort of change the agenda around a little bit, we definitely want to give you a work update on what has been happening on the Transportation Task Group. But I would start just first before turning it over to Megan O'Toole and maybe Colin, who I see here. I don't know if I just wanted to let folks know the Transportation Task Group now is hosting public meetings. We are meeting weekly at this point. So welcome participation from folks now that we are moving into the substance of exploring, deepening the public engagement work and exploring the options. We have established standing meetings, 3:30 on Mondays. Join us if you are interested and able. But we'll walk through the public engagement and the sort of RFP and the technical analysis work that's beginning to ramp. But I'm going to turn it over to Megan and Colin to contextualize for us both the gap analysis that you've been doing and then the rulemaking related to advanced clean cars and advanced clean trucks, because that will give us a better sense of the baseline. So turn it over to you guys.
Thanks, Joey. Hi, everyone. So as Joey said, we're going to start off with just some kind of, I guess I'll use the term level set, since that's what we called it when we did the webinar last month for the transportation work that's been going on related to the climate action plan. But as you know, the initial climate action plan included a set of transportation emission reductions recommendations, and we are moving forward right now with adopting the Advanced Clean Cars 2 program for passenger cars and light duty trucks. For medium and heavy duty vehicles, the Advanced Clean Trucks rule, the low NOx medium and heavy duty omnibus rule from California, and then the phase 2 rule for greenhouse gas emission standards for trucks and trailers. And so we know that we're doing that, and we have information that allows us to do an initial analysis of the emissions reductions that we can expect in the future from implementation of those programs in Vermont. And we work this into the level set because we feel it's really important to understand what emission reductions we're getting from what we know we're going to be accomplishing in that regulatory space, and then use that to understand the gap in emissions reductions in the transportation sector specifically that we need to so where we need to close that gap and implement additional policies and programs to achieve the additional emissions reductions in the transportation sector. So Colin Smythe from DEC, who has worked with and is very familiar with the analyses that we use to determine emission, to make, I shouldn't say determine, that's too exact. We make estimates of emissions reductions in this space based on a variety of assumptions that we can certainly go into more detail on for anyone that has specific questions. We won't do that now because it would certainly take the rest of the meeting. But I'm going to share my screen and show a helpful graphic that hopefully will be familiar to folks that did attend the Level Set webinar back in April. And I'll turn it over to Colin, but this is just kind of a nice visualization of this gap that we're looking at needing to address in additional policies and programs in the transportation space. And then the other side of that is the reductions that we hope to achieve through the adoption of the rules that I just listed. And so when Colin is finished explaining how, what it is that we're looking at here, I'm happy to give an update on the rulemaking progress itself. So I'll turn it over to Colin. And I hope you can see my screen. Let me know if you cannot.
We can see the screen, but Megan, just to make sure that it's totally clear, you seem to be reporting that about a third of the gap existing reduction requirement can be met through this rule or this set of rules, and that the remaining gap is roughly 2/3 of the total reduction required. Is that right?
So I think Colin will answer your questions in his kind of walkthrough of the slides. So I'm going to
okay, thank you.
to him.
Sorry.
No problem.
Rich, if it's okay, this is Jared. I just want to quickly note the important, I know you know this, but just for just to make sure it's clear for everybody on the call, there's an important difference between the gap for the transportation sector emissions reductions and the overall gap that's needed. So this slide is showing roughly, you know, a 2/3 remaining gap for the transportation sector. But since that's only about, well, it's about 40% of our statewide emissions, you know, that's why when I said earlier that we may expect somewhere around the range of 10% of the overall needed reductions to be met by ACC2, just that important difference between the overall needed reductions and the transportation gap as presented here is just one slice of that.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Colin?
Great, thank you. And thanks, Jared. That's helpful context for sure. Yes, so I'm going to start this off and I'm going to try to keep this somewhat high level. And if people have specific questions, I'm happy to go into it. But essentially, let me start off by saying that there is lots of uncertainty in all of this. But in trying to come up with kind of this gap analysis and what ACC2, Advanced Clean Cars 2 might cover, we had to kind of make some assumptions, best estimates, things like that. And so I'll try to lay those out a little bit for you. So essentially by 2025 and 2030, we kind of needed to have I'm going to say business as usual case in which to kind of determine what our gap would be, because we have our reductions targets that we need to hit in that sector. And so we need something to kind of set that against. And so we could have used the 2018 greenhouse gas inventory number for transportation, but since, especially with COVID in the last few years, transportation emissions have gone down drastically. And so we didn't feel like that was totally appropriate. But figuring out that number was kind of an important but fraught with potential errors decision. So what we ended up going with was coming up with a preliminary value for 2021, which was the latest data that we had in terms of the JFO fuel data that we use. And I have not kind of finalized that number. That is a preliminary number for 2021, but it's using about the same methodologies. I just haven't kind of tweaked it all. And so we decided that 2021 was probably a reasonable guess in terms of what emissions could be like in 2025 and 2030, just because with COVID, we don't know if the transportation numbers are going to rebound or if they're going to stay low or go up somewhat, or if they're going to start going down with the policies and the adoption of more EVs. And so we felt like kind of flatlining that 2021 number was a reasonable estimate to go with. So I'm just gonna start there and say, obviously there are lots of factors that go into that could be questioned, but that was our best estimate. In terms of Advanced Clean Cars 2, so, well, I guess let me step back again. If we pull that 2.93 number, 2.93 million metric tons of CO2e forward, we find that is about our 2025 goal in the transportation sector. And so that is, as I just said, there's tons of uncertainty with that. Whether or not we will actually be at that level at 2025, I don't know. But in terms of Advanced Clean Cars 2, 2025 is a little bit moot anyway, because the regulation doesn't really start until 2025. And so we're not really going to see any reductions before that anyway. So this is really focused on 2030. And so if we pull that forward to 2030, this is what it would look like. And I'll just go into a little bit of the Advanced Clean Cars 2 piece of this, and Megan can talk in more detail about this as well. But Advanced Clean Car 2, and I think actually Deirdre is on the line. I saw her earlier. She can certainly talk more about this as well. But essentially what we did was Deirdre had worked with NESCOM, and who is kind of a partner in this, air agencies, to come up with an estimated number of zero emission vehicles that would be delivered to Vermont for sale in each year based on the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation. It's kind of based on a certain number of credits, zero emission vehicle credits that manufacturers are going to need. And so, again, I won't get into all these. There are kind of a little stringency levels for each year, but there's also going to be some potential flexibilities in how OEMs, the manufacturers, meet those credit requirements. And so that adds another level of uncertainty. But so the scenario you see here is kind of a middle of the road scenario in terms of it's not the most amount of zero emission vehicles we could see out of the regulation, but it's our kind of reasonable approximation of the total number based on manufacturers using some of those flexibility mechanisms. And it's what we thought was a reasonable amount. And so coming up with those totals, and that also, that the regulation also has kind of a cap for the amount of plug-in hybrids that can be used to meet those credits as well. And so that's incorporated into this too. And so what we did then, after kind of Deirdre had worked with NESCOM to come up with those, we adjusted them a little bit based on some of the recent modifications to the regulation in California, and use those zero emission vehicle and PHEV totals and incorporated them into a workbook that May Butler put together for EAN for a similar type of analysis, and came up with, and I can go into kind of how that tool works if people are interested, but came up with an emissions reductions associated with that number of zero emission vehicles. And I will also put the important caveat in here that this analysis is assuming that these cars are purchased and driven as much as the ICE vehicles, the internal combustion engine vehicles they are replacing, which is not a safe assumption to make necessarily, but this is kind of a best case scenario, if you will. So this would certainly require all the work in the incentive space and the EVSE, the infrastructure piece, to enable these vehicles and incentivize people to purchase them and drive them. So sorry, that was a little bit of a whirlwind, but that was kind of the quick overview of this, and I'm happy to answer questions or dig in deeper wherever anybody would like to. And Deirdre or Megan, if I missed anything or misrepresented anything, please feel free to jump in and correct me.
Oh, and one more thing, and I'm sorry, I was trying to find this while you were talking, and Jane brought this up as a good additional point that I think we could make in elaborating on this is how implementation of Advanced Clean Cars 2 in particular is likely to impact this kind of gap analysis beyond 2030. Understanding that after 2030, Advanced Clean Cars 2, in terms of the percentage of EVs that are going to be required to be delivered by manufacturers, is going to ramp up really significantly, and kind of improve the picture in this space in terms of the amount of emissions reductions. And so I don't know, maybe if you could just speak about that briefly. I know we didn't pull up that to share, that visual to share, but I think, as Jane said, it's important.
Sure. Yeah. And that's a great point. And thanks, Jane, for flagging that. Yeah, I guess the kind of key takeaway there is that by 2035, the regulation requires all new vehicle, light duty and medium duty vehicle sales to be zero emission, or at least for the manufacturers to deliver 100% of those vehicles that are zero emission. And so Yes, it definitely does ramp up. I honestly don't remember the percentages off the top of my head. But the flexibilities, I believe, also phase out kind of, I don't remember the date there, but well before, I think it's before 2030 even, or maybe it's at 2030. And so, yes, it does ramp up. It's still, you're still going to have kind of the existing stock of internal combustion engine vehicles. And so obviously emissions from the sector will not be zero by any means, but it will be driven kind of by the turnover after that, and assuming that the vast majority of sales, certainly in-state sales, will be a zero emission vehicle.
Thanks, Colin. Jane?
Yeah, that's really helpful, Colin. Thank you. And I guess just to put a finer point on that, just to keep everything out there, is the way, if I remember correctly, just how many years off we are in meeting our 2030 reduction requirement with this singular policy. Is it takes us about 3 years beyond 2030 for us to feel with a higher degree of confidence that we would hit our 2030 statutory reduction based on this policy alone. So is that how I'm remembering that spreadsheet that you showed? So by 2033, the expectation is that the number of EVs would essentially help us realize that our statutory reduction for 2030 is what we would be, about 3 years off.
I would have to look at the spreadsheet, but I believe you're right. I believe it was a couple of years, 2 or 3 years. Yes.
I would just note again the important distinction between the statutory requirement for overall emissions reductions versus transportation sector reductions. And even if the modeling suggests that, given a number of assumptions that we don't have full certainty about, but even in a best case scenario, if we were able to meet the transportation sector share of responsibility by 2033 that is meant for 2030, and I think we do need to focus on the actual legal requirements as written in the law for 2030, but that would just be for the transportation sector. And there may be scenarios in which we need to get more emissions reductions out of the transportation sector if other sectors do not pull their weight.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Jared, to continue to make. And I guess I also just want to say that this isn't the only policy that we're implementing in the transportation sector. Of course, it's the largest and most impactful, but there are other programmatic levers that AOT and others are pulling also.
All right, thanks for taking us through that. I think it's really useful for this committee to see the data. So I'm looking forward to, as time goes by, I'm looking forward to opportunities for us to see the data in a variety of the areas that we have responsibility to look at. Joey, back to you. Are there other topics in the transportation report you'd like to make?
I wanted to, is there anything else more to say about advanced clean cars, advanced clean trucks? I think a little bit more on process, Megan, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So I guess just to let folks know what the steps are in the rulemaking right now is that we're working very expeditiously. And I just want to call out Deirdre Ritzer, who's on the call. She's the chief of the mobile sources section at DEC. We're working really hard to get a rulemaking package together in accordance with the deadlines in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And there is our most looming deadline is delivering where we are in the process to the Climate Council for their meeting on May 16th. And so what councilors can expect to review at that meeting is a draft of the regulation, which will be still very much in draft form at that point. We're working really closely with other states that are either working on adopting or have gone before us in adopting some of these rules to make sure that we're being consistent with our Section 177 state partners and with California. And then we also are developing a rulemaking record that includes technical support, a regulatory summary, a public outreach outline, and this will all be explained in a cover letter that will be going to the council as well. But we fully expect to meet the deadlines, as I said, but this is really complex, and it's a pretty massive regulatory puzzle that we're putting together. We have our existing program, which is our low and zero emission vehicle rules for light duty and medium duty vehicles. And then we're adding on a lot of regulations in the heavy duty space, including criteria pollutant and greenhouse gas emission reductions, and then the electrification in the medium and heavy duty space as well. And then of course the updates to the light duty in terms of the Advanced Clean Cars 2 electrification phase in schedule. So it's a lot to put together, but we will be sharing more with the council in less than a couple weeks.
Thanks, Megan. I have Gina and then TJ.
Well, I just wanted to say, Megan and Colin did not have to get into explaining what these California standards are and how they work. I think for most people, they don't know, and this group obviously knows, but I think as we do our public involvement, we need to explain the relationship between California and the state and how the rule affects the manufacturers and the cars that are delivered. So I don't know if everyone here gets it. I can get it barely, but I think it's a burden on us as we talk about this with the public and in our public discussions that we really kind of lay it out. But obviously today we're just getting into the nitty gritty.
Yeah, and we're working really hard to try to explain that in summary form and also in a pretty good amount of detail in the supporting documentation for the rule, Gina. But I think the really important element that I think gets lost sometimes is that this is a regulatory requirement imposed on automobile manufacturers. It's not a requirement imposed on consumers.
Right.
And so that's where the compliance obligation lies. And I think that can be confusing, but I think is really critical to communicating to the public that they're not going to be forced to do anything via this regulatory requirement. It's that we are setting a technology standard with the auto manufacturers.
That was exactly my point. Thank you, Megan.
Mm-hmm.
TJ and then Jared.
At the risk of going too far in the weeds, because I know what I don't know, which is a lot in this space, that Megan, or Colin, is there any opportunity still for advocacy on the rule as opposed to kind of straight implementation? And the reason I ask is you said it was, the requirement is for, in 2035, 100% of vehicles to be delivered, not necessarily kind of placed in service or, actually sold. And so is there still room for advocacy there, or is that done?
Yeah, I think that CARB is the California Air Resources Board. It has a pretty locked in proposed rule at this point. They officially proposed their rule on April 12th, and they communicated to us very clearly that is the rule, which honestly, from a regulatory process perspective, we appreciate because we're adopting our rule parallel to their process. And so if they made any substantive changes later this year, we'd have to start over again, and then we'd miss the deadline for implementation. So I think we appreciate the finality where they are in their process, and they've done years of public engagement and, development of the rule up until this point. So I don't think they really rushed that. In terms of placed in service versus delivered for sale, the point of compliance, you're correct, is delivery for the passenger and light duty and in some cases medium duty rules. For advanced clean trucks, those auto manufacturers of those vehicles will only receive compliance credit when the vehicle is placed in service, which from our perspective is much more beneficial because it's a guaranteed place in service that's registered in the state of Vermont. And it's, kind of the emissions reductions are easier for us to be confident about. But we have like advocated for years that placed in service is a much better point of compliance, but we are small and we've lost that battle. So.
Jared?
Thanks, Rich. I just wanted to follow up on Gina's point about communicating this, which I really appreciated, and I agreed with the parts that were said afterwards. I think the other piece that is important to communicate, and I'm not going to use the exact legal language or cite the section numbers or the case law on this, but is, and Megan or Deirdre, please correct me if I try to too simplistically summarize this. But I've heard questions from a number of folks of, well, why doesn't Vermont set its own standards? And my understanding is that based on court decisions and federal law, the choice for states is either to follow the federal standards on vehicles or the California standards. And part of that is to avoid a patchwork of standards that would be really difficult for auto manufacturers to comply with. So our choice is a less strong, in a more polluting federal standard, or a stronger standard that will do more to reduce emissions and costs for folks by following the California standard. So that's really the choice. It's federal or California, and that's what we're limited to. Because I think I've heard a number of times the question come up, well, what about a Vermont path? And it's my understanding is that that's not open to us. It's an A or B choice.
Yeah, that's correct, Jared. The Clean Air Act preempts states from creating their own unique regulatory programs in the motor vehicle space. And if we do want to implement anything more stringent, then we have to adopt the California program. And that's something that Deirdre and I will be explaining in the cover letter to the council, is that unfortunately, this is not an opportunity for the council to comment on the stringency or the impact or effectiveness of the rule. It's an opportunity more to just be informed about what the rule will do, to ask questions about the rule, but then of course to comment on the technical support documentation, but the rule itself is locked up because of the reasons that you just articulated. We can't create what's called a third car under the Clean Air Act and mandate our own unique motor vehicle emission standards that are different from California's or the federal government's.
I don't want to drag out this part of the agenda too long because we need to turn to other things, but I'll still ask a question anyway. I apologize. Briefly, can you tell us where our neighboring states are in adopting the California rule or not?
Yep. So we're in good company. All of our neighboring states, at least in terms of immediately in New England or the Northeast, are moving forward either with the light duty and the heavy duty aspects of the new rules, or one or the other, except for New Hampshire. New Hampshire is not, I think, pursuing any of those pathways. But yeah, all of New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, I'm sure Rhode Island will follow shortly. Those are all, and Maine is also, they're way ahead of us in terms of adopting heavy duty. They've already begun their process. So we're in good company. Okay, thanks very much. Joey, I think there are some more topics here on the transportation.
Yeah, just a few more, but TJ, is that a lingering hand or is that a new one? Okay, so a couple different things. I'll provide a brief update on public engagement, turn it over to the ANR AOT team to talk about the RFP work, and also then want to create a space ideally for Andrea or others to talk about some of the other analyses that are underway related to VMT reduction strategies. We're talking a lot about vehicles right now, but there's other work underway as well. Related to public engagement, and anyone please jump in. I think people are probably aware we've hosted 2 webinars thus far, a level set webinar on April 1st, and in partnership with the Vermont Clean Cities Coalition hosted another webinar on looking at a clean transportation standard, looking at what other states have done to implement a performance-based standard to cover the transportation sector. We are now ramping up, and ideally it is on your radar and ideally your calendar for May 13th to host another webinar with Vermont Clean Cities Coalition at noon to look at regional cap and invest strategies, looking at the Transportation Climate Initiative program and the Western Climate Initiative program. And those are, yeah, again, cap and invest strategies. So we have 2 experts joining a broader Climate Council team. There will be ample opportunity for questions and input at those events. The May 13th event is the only other thing we have locked in at this moment, but we've sort of sketched out a plan that will need to be informed by the RFP and the technical analysis that we know we're going to need and ideally get, but you're going to hear about some challenges in that space in just a second. But we also do hope to do some sort of, in the summertime, some stakeholder engagement. And we hope to glean from the robust public engagement that's going to happen, as Megan shared, related to the rulemaking, just gather input from folks on, to inform the space more broadly. And then there's other complementary work that we are tracking and working with broader network of stakeholders, including, again, the Vermont Clean Cities Coalition, the network action team of the Energy Action Network, which led by Capstone Community Action and Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility, is doing pretty deep dive, and I think a handful of focus groups to really understand barriers for low income earners and historically overburdened Vermonters in particular, related to accessing clean, affordable, convenient transportation systems. So there's a bunch of work not under our umbrella, but undertaken by important partners in this conversation that is going to inform, I hope, the sort of our work as a task group, as a subcommittee, and ideally the council moving forward. But again, just to remind folks, 3:30 on Mondays, if you're interested, we're going to start, planning more of this stuff out. But I want to turn it over to either Jane or Andrea to talk about the RFP to inform the technical analysis and where that stands. And then ideally, Andrea, talk about a bunch of the analyses that are underway right now at AOT that are complementary but connected. So if you don't mind, if one of you will take it away to talk about those things, that'd be great.
I'm happy to do it, Andrea, but also happy to defer to you.
You go ahead on that RFP, and then I can fill in with the other stuff that we're doing.
Okay, so Megan took the lead on putting together a U.S. Climate Alliance grant around funding 2 components of transportation analyses, a phase 1 that looked at a more refined analysis of what Colin just shared with you all about the emissions reductions that we expect to see from advanced clean cars to and we already have it for advanced clean trucks, similar to what we already have for advanced clean trucks with NESCOM overseeing that work. We were funded for that phase 1 analyses, but phase 2 looked at answering some questions around, well, based on what we expect to get and what we know we need to do with emissions reductions, what are some Vermont impacts or application of some of the policies that we've been putting forward and considering through the webinars? So like, what would it look like to scale a performance standard to Vermont in the transportation sector? What would it look like to join WCI or other cap and invest programs? And so we were not funded through the U.S. Climate Alliance for that second component of the analysis, largely because their response back to us was, use your IIJA funds. Like, you have IIJA funds that are specific for carbon reduction strategy in transportation. Why can't you use that? We're starting to look at that collaboratively with AOT around what AOT needs to do with respect to those funds by when, knowing that there's this larger sector-wide analysis and questions we want to ask, and then also further analysis on the greenhouse emissions benefits that we could realize through redirection and changes of programmatic areas that AOT works in. So I think the timeline for that is mid to end of June for us to actually have clarity around the funding there. And so we have this RFP that we built based on Megan's good work of the grant application for U.S. Climate Alliance. We folded that up, and Megan did, into an RFP for transportation that we all had a chance to review and comment on. That's essentially ready to go and be posted. Even Secretary Moore has already reviewed it and commented on it. But we don't have any funding source for that. And we had laid out a clear sort of order of operations for work for the Transportation Task Group, assuming that we would have this RFP already posted and be expecting back in early September to be starting to get information back to inform policy recommendations. It does not appear that we'll have that by this fall. And so there's varying opinions, I think, in the task group about how to proceed without having Vermont specific technical analyses, but that's where we're at. And we are continuing to trying to find funding to put the RFP out there. And so there is other analyses that AOT is leading on that will help inform other areas of work in the transportation sector, and would have been all tied neatly in a bow by this RFP, we had hoped, but not quite there yet.
Thanks, Jane. A little bit in the weeds. Can you help me out? IIJA?
It's a bipartisan infrastructure bill.
Oh, okay. So the idea is that we got infrastructure money, we should be able to spend it for this analysis. And is this something that the committee or the council needs to weigh in on?
No, I think we're just waiting for AOT to make it through their guidance and to have clear authority to spend the money in the space. And I think we're cautiously hopeful that those funds will be able to fund the RFP and analysis. It's just a timing consideration at this point.
Okay, other questions on this? Joey, any other part of your report?
Go ahead, Jared.
Sorry, just one question. The note that you made towards the end there, Jane, about other analysis that either exists or will be in process that will also be helpful to us, even if the broader comprehensive comparative transportation policy analysis is on a longer timeline than we would want due to lack of funds. The question that comes to mind for me is one of those pieces of analysis that I remember being very eager to see and looking forward to that I haven't heard an update on, and I'm wondering if you can just provide it briefly, was the final deliverable from Cadmus on the marginal abatement cost curve in terms of looking at the cost effectiveness of different measures in comparison to each other. Is there an update on that marginal abatement cost curve work?
That's on the agenda at the end of today.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
That'll come up in a minute. Thanks, Jared. We will turn to that in a minute. Anything further, Joey, on that?
I just want to give Andrea the opportunity to speak to some of those other analyses that are underway. If you don't mind briefly, Andrea.
Yeah, I can go really quickly, or I can even just drop a note in the chat if I feel like there's a little pressure to move on the agenda.
No, you're okay. Just
okay. I think what we were talking about is the study that is currently underway for VMT, vehicle miles traveled, and we have a consultant on board to analyze that and how smart growth strategies can help to meet emissions reductions in the transportation sector. And that study is also looking at the co-benefits from doing that to health and other benefits. Of course, we have our EV charging deployment plan underway because we've got considerable funding to get that out. So we've got some requirements that go along with that funding. So that's another thing that we're working on. With the incentive programs that we have, I dropped in the chat some of the funding related to those incentive programs. And we have a consultant on board to help us administer that. And we are working with them to also provide an analysis and an optimization of spending those funds and what we need to get the most cars on the road. So those two things, the VMT and the incentives optimization, that's information that we'll have in the fall timeframe. And then going along with what Jean mentioned through the IIJA money and the authorization just a couple of weeks ago of the carbon reduction program, the guidance that came out with that a couple of weeks ago, we're looking at doing an assessment of our capital program and our existing programs to understand what emissions reductions we can get from that. And in the carbon reduction program, there's a call for each agency to create a carbon reduction strategy by, it's not, doesn't have to be done until November of 2023. But we are looking at ways to, make modifications or include additional programs that can reduce carbon reductions. One of those things is looking at things like the lighting that we have in our infrastructure, looking at our right-of-way for alternative uses of energy. So I was looking at Gina's 2016 solar plan earlier today and hope to resurrect things like that that can be included in our strategy. So that's sort of where we're at. Significant amounts of money included in those, like I think $30-something million for the carbon reduction program for Vermont over 5 years. So I think we are looking at already having $6 million allocated to that for this year. That's all I have on that.
Thanks. So, Joey, does that wrap it up?
I think that wraps it up, at least for this conversation, and it's an ongoing one as I noted earlier. So hope, as Jared just dropped in the chat, that folks can join us on May 13th and continue to participate in the conversation, and we can move forward. Thanks, Rich.
All right, well, thanks. I mean, I suppose it goes without saying that all of this work is going to come back through to the committee as we assess what recommendations we want to make in the transportation arena, both now and on a forward-going basis. So thank you for all that work. It's great. Turning to the biomass test group. TJ, I think you are set up to let us know what's going on there.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll provide an update, but Liz and Megan were both participating, and Adam as well. And so please fill in where I leave out. So the Biomass Task Group has met at least twice since the last time this committee met, and has done quite a bit of work and spent a lot of time on shaping the scope of what actually we're setting out to accomplish. And we made a lot of progress. I wouldn't say we're 100% in agreement yet, but we had quite a bit of discussion yesterday on kind of prioritizing the tabled actions from you'll recall the Ag and Ecosystems Committee had several recommendations and that were tabled by the Climate Council and directed to this task group. So where we're kind of honing in on is a scope that prioritizes considering the ongoing operation and expansion of existing electric-led biomass facilities, existing and new in Vermont, and based on their role in climate mitigation and their benefits and impacts. And doing that, evaluating impacts to surrounding communities, residents, air quality, evaluating the source materials like harvest activities for all the products procured, and then also keeping in mind potential expansion for district heating and what that means. And then secondly, to look at existing research to consider components for biomass procurement for pellet production. And then also, again, looking at harvest levels that maintain ecosystem integrity. And then finally, in the kind of the first tranche of prioritized areas, considering components of educational programs to encourage those appropriate practices when using wood heat. And I think that spans the whole breadth of production to consumption. So, that's a lot narrower scope, or maybe just somewhat narrower scope than originally was in the ag and ecosystems recommendations. And the reason for that was there was a few reasons for that. First, recognizing that the initial climate action plan calls for wood heat as part of the solution, and particularly as it relates to the clean heat standard. We talked more about this yesterday and have gone, there's been a little back and forth about this, but I think it's important to make clear that it doesn't mean that we're done thinking about biomass for thermal use. It just means that we're not prioritizing it as one of the first things we look at. And the other reason for that is really biomass for both thermal and for electricity, but biomass for thermal uses are expected to be examined in the life cycle analysis that science and data are doing. And so we don't want this committee or this task group to kind of get ahead of that analysis when that information will really be foundational in forming the discussion there. And so we wanted to just tackle what we could address up front. So what that means and what's tabled are really the specific items of addressing the use of biomass for appropriate scaled thermal heat generation, and the idea of informing under what conditions biomass is appropriate. And so, there's this, when you think of, hey, what conditions are biomass appropriate? Hey, the initial climate action plan said clean heat standard, biomass is appropriate. So yes, that's all true, but I think we came to a spot yesterday where that is true, but as we get more information, we have to stay open, recognizing the Climate Council process last year. Everybody knows it was short, it was too fast. We did what was required, but we all wished we had more time. And so to use and gather this information and be open to revisiting these things if information tells us we should be going on a different path. So I think that was generally the scope. Yesterday, Liz mentioned earlier, we really had our first technical meeting yesterday, and we were beginning the process of really understanding the existing research. We have made a lot of effort to scope this to really build the foundation of everybody's knowledge base so that we're not talking past each other. We have the same level of information. We can actually make good recommendations going forward. So we had a really good discussion with Dr. Todd Buchholz, who was a UVM Gund affiliate, who did quite a bit of research in this area and really started to ground us in greenhouse gas emissions of local wood energy from the Northeast forests, and generally kind of starting to get there with highlighting the significant differences in greenhouse gas impact depending on the fuel source and the harvesting. And so we've kind of teed up at a number of ideas and a number of other experts that we might want to have come into the committee to actually help build that foundation of knowledge and then really tackle these issues as the life cycle analysis comes in and as we can. So I think I'll stop there. That's the bulk of the update, and see if Liz or Megan or Adam, you have anything to add, or if there's any conversation or questions.
Thanks, TJ. I understand you also have a recommendation, just to confirm the conversation we had earlier in this meeting, to appoint Megan, Liz, and Adam as this committee's representation to the task force, and that if that happens, you would not be serving on the task force anymore. Is that right?
Mostly. We didn't discuss yesterday me not serving on the task force. I didn't want to prematurely make that determination. We did discuss that Adam had been nominated for and recommended for the cross-sector mitigation committee, and then to be appointed to the biomass task group. I believe Megan's participation was originally as a chair of the Science and Data Committee, also was originally, through that mechanism. So we didn't discuss that explicitly. So we discussed Adam's participation. Megan was already kind of on the task group, and
okay. So I'm bringing it up because it's important for this committee to be clear who our representatives are. I'm happy if you want to continue to participate, but I think that as we discussed earlier today, we should confirm that those 3 people will be serving on the task group from going forward. And I understand that's your recommendation. I'm just trying to be clear about it.
Correct. Yes. Thank you, Rich. That is the recommendation, that I no longer participate on that task group. Although it has piqued my interest yesterday, but I think I need to, for my sanity, to step off of that, focus on this committee and other things. And so it would be Liz, Adam, and Megan representing cross sector.
Okay. Thank you. Any further conversation on the report? TJ, it sounds like you're getting into the data, just like we saw a minute ago with transportation, and good. That seems to me to be really good progress. Any other comments, Christine?
I just want to thank you all. This is super important work that's going to serve Vermont really well. And this conversation's been building for quite some time. And I think it's really good for the state of Vermont that such a diverse and thoughtful and diligent group is doing the hard work to work through this. So thank you very much.
Anything further with respect to that task group? All right then. The marginal abatement cost study and maybe any other updates related to technical analyses. Is that for you to report on, Jane, or someone else?
Yeah, yeah. I should have just done it when Jared asked before, because it's a really brief update to say that it was supposed to be done by the end of April. And ironically, we ran into trouble subbing SCI on our Cadmus contract because you may or may not know, in the original contract with Cadmus, they were going to produce this, the marginal abatement curve with support from EFG. It made sense to work directly with SEI to do it, who the state has under contract for other work, but because SEI is an internationally based company, I couldn't get their subcontract approved because we have like data storage issues around ADS about data moving internationally. It's stalled for weeks to get ADS to approve that. So we're in the clear. SEI is moving forward with that, and we should have it done in the next few weeks. So I'm hopeful that at your next meeting, we'll be able to present it. They had already been making good progress. It's just not done yet. And then the only other comment I'll just mention on that seems germane to like emissions and emissions reductions, and of course, meeting our targets, our statutory emissions reduction targets, is that, the ag sector has continued to question the way we track our emissions to realize the full benefits of programs and practices they put on the ground for both gross emissions, but then of course the question of net emissions continues to come up. We did get our U.S. Climate Alliance grant and are moving forward with an RFP to further study the ag sector and the way we track emissions in the greenhouse gas inventory. So just as an FYI, that is moving forward. So lots of other RFPs and technical analyses happening also, but most germane to cross sector is that one.
Will there be an item on the agenda for the full Climate Council meeting where we could see the array of studies that are ongoing and some ideas about who's doing them and the timeline for them? seems like that'd be useful for the whole council.
Yeah, that would be useful, probably. But maybe we can, I will frame that up. We have a section on the agenda for the council on the 16th to talk about work planning. As a preview, we're proposing canceling the June council meeting, and the council won't meet again until September. And so as a component of that, we're going to talk about the rationale behind that decision and the work that's going on between now and then, as well as the role of the steering committee between June and September to keep things moving forward, to plan and prep for the council to have substantive meetings this fall.
Okay, thanks, Jane. And I do want to return to the schedule for this subcommittee in just a minute, but I see TJ has a comment.
Yeah, just Jane, if you, it was related to Rich's comment, but on the life cycle analysis, because I do think it relates to a lot of the work of this committee, if you could just give a brief update on the status of that, or maybe it's Megan as Science and Data Chair, one of you guys.
Either one, happy. And Science and Data reviewed the most up-to-date version of the RFP yesterday on behalf of the what is now a cross-cutting task group that is composed of science and data folks, as well as representation from Ag and Eco. And that RFP is in really good shape, it sounds like, and I think we're meeting tomorrow afternoon as in our staff to finalize the RFP and hopefully be in a place where we can advance posting it in the coming week or so.
Jane, do you have any comments or any heads up you want to give us about future meetings of this committee?
No, I think that's I'd be interested to hear from all of you, especially task group leads and work around timing, because this meeting got bumped back to accommodate schedules and Peter leaving. We have another cross-sector meeting on the books pretty soon. And so the question is, can we cancel that one and then just not meet again as a group until June? Or do we need to rejigger all of the cross-sector meetings to sort of be a month from now, because the meeting in June will be 6 weeks, I believe, from now, rather than a month. I think that's the question.
Thanks, Jane. Any comments from committee members?
Jean, when is, sorry, the next cross sector? I can look on my calendar, but do you have it top of mind?
It's 2 weeks from today.
Okay. Well, one of the questions I have is, well, we'd flagged early in the conversation, depending on what happens with the clean heat standard, is it vetoed or is it advancing? And is there any sort of convening that we would want to do to think about what that means? So maybe it means that in 2 weeks, we'd certainly have the answer to that question at that time. So maybe it's helpful to keep that on the books. So that's an open question. And then I just am wondering about, and maybe this is a question that is left for that moment, but I'm kind of just wondering if the clean heat standard does get vetoed and it's not successfully overridden, that's a potential scenario. Is the ANR doing work sort of related to if we don't have a clean heat standard, we don't have certain transportation policy or regulatory tools in place, how you all might be preparing to analyze what that means for the obligation to meet 2025 and be on track for 2030, and sort of any legal analysis you might be doing or have done, or just work you might be preparing for rulemaking. So I just want to ask that question about, seems like maybe we should keep the meeting on the books for 2 weeks just because there's some uncertainty there, and I would be helpful for me to just understand. And again, maybe we can leave my second question until that meeting.
Megan?
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to respond to that really briefly, Joey. I mean, I think you make a really good point, and I think we definitely need to keep talking as things develop across the different efforts and initiatives that are moving, including the clean heat standard. But I guess, just in terms of ANR's, response and kind of responsibility in this realm, just also wanted to point out that I think it really is also the council's responsibility to help answer that question as well, and shouldn't lie solely with ANR. And so we would be looking to work, with the council on investigating and answering that question, should we really need to dig in again in the thermal sector.
Absolutely. So maybe we punt that into a conversation if we need to regroup, but do folks agree that maybe we should just keep that time and date on the books, and if we don't need it, we can, is that okay with people? Ideally, we don't need it.
I've seen a few thumbs up on that idea, Joey, so why don't we just decide to do that? It might be that if we're trying to regroup after a veto, that it's, how do you say it? So it might be a little early to actually have a game plan, worked out, but to begin the conversation, certainly at that point, it seems timely. So I'm sensing support from committee members for keeping that date on the books, at least for that reason. Are there any other considerations that we should have in mind if we are thinking about, well, we don't need to convene for that reason on the 19th? Is there some other really timely, time-sensitive thing that would suggest that we should meet anyway? Because if there weren't, I think my suggestion would be that we skip the May 19 and just go to the June meeting. But I'm taking nominations. If people have other things that they really want to advance for the May meeting, feel free. So let me suggest the following: that TJ and Jane and I will, put our heads together and let you know what we think. And if folks, disagree with whatever that decision is, they can just chime in at that point.
Yeah, thanks.
I got my
Rich.
fingers crossed that we're not going to meet.
The...
We're not going to need to meet for this reason. My fingers are still crossed.
Right. I was too slow on the mute button, but now that if SEI is under contract, I'm assuming that the marginal abatement cost curve won't be ready in 2 weeks, but okay. So that would be the next meeting anyway. That would be the other reason to meet.
Okay, thanks, TJ. Okay, so if folks are agreeable to that, we'll keep the date on the calendar so that we can meet if we need to, and we can hope that we don't need to. All right, thanks. Anything further? Any further committee business? I'd like to turn to public comments. Bram?
Somewhat related to the biomass conversation. As I have said before, that when we burn a tree up, we release all of its carbon in a few hours. And when we let it rot on the forest floor, we do it in a few years. And when we mill it into lumber and put it in a building, we sequester that carbon for potentially a couple centuries. And given what I have been reading recently about the advances in large scale wooden construction, high-rise wooden construction, I do wonder if at some point the council should be thinking somewhere about the overall reduction in carbon, given how carbon intensive concrete and steel are, of encouraging in some way the substitution of lumber construction for carbon and steel construction in the state.
I saw a thumbs up from Adam. I totally agree. It's a great topic for us to take up. The so-called mass timber idea is an important idea, and for Vermont, in particular, given our forest resources, it makes a lot of sense for us to pay attention to that.
I would just note quickly, I'm sure there's a number of folks working in this space who could be helpful resources, but I know that the Vermont Forest Industry Network, led by Christine McGowan at the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, has been doing a lot of work in this area, convenings, research, and could be really helpful there. But thanks for bringing that up, Ram. Agreed.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask just another question? And maybe it's a process question, doesn't have to be answered now, but like some of the cross-cutting work that was big and important, I just kind of want to just ask the question about how that might work, that work might be carrying forward or not. And in part, I ask that because like who's carrying the ball on just straight up like conservation measures and just, you know, reduction measures? I know no one. So this is where I just want to like put out there again that there's the cross-cutting stuff. And so maybe conservation and consumption issues, you know, that was addressed in some of that, but it's not actually being held. So I just want to flag, and Jane, maybe just take it away because you have insight on that, but it's clearly a gap.
Yeah, I do think it is a gap. Marion and I talk a lot about that. We talk a lot about how in many spaces, the pressure to produce the climate action plan, so, and especially in those sectors in ag and eco and rural resilience, there was a lot of feeling that they would come back and further prioritize and lift up because there are so many recommendations in that space. It's hard to figure that out. That hasn't happened yet. And there, you know, there just really isn't capacity around supporting more work than we as staff are doing right now. And so I think that'll be a really good question for the council as we think about what prioritization looks like. And that's going to be a focus of the conversation around work planning and the work of the steering committee to prep for the fall to think about the next biennium and how we lift up and further refine the climate action plan, especially in that space. And then at some point, it will be helpful to think about how we're framing up the work priorities of the climate office. We will hire and have specific people, like Megan is dedicated to mitigation. We will have people dedicated to natural and working lands and resilience and adaptation. And so that will be added capacity in the space to have people who are leading in that office, leading and supporting the council. And I've been thinking a lot about how those people will support the different buckets of work for the council, as well as their own work for implementation for A&R and beyond. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of, I think that is stalling a bit, or at least stalling on leadership from the council and support. And that's an important area not to lose focus on.
Thanks, Joey. Jane. I'd like to open up the meeting now to public comments. Are there members of the public present who would like to speak to the committee? Just raise your hands if you are. If I don't see anybody on a telephone, so I think everybody could raise their hand if they wanted to. I'm not seeing any hands raised. All right, in that case, I think we're ready to adjourn. And thanks to the committee members and members of the public for attending today's meeting. We may be back again in a couple of weeks or not. We'll just have to wait and see. Thanks for the progress made today, everybody. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Enjoy the great weather.
Bye, everyone.